Christianity is the one religion that you're allowed to despair. That was a crazy movie because it was a great movie, but it seemed like there was resistance to that movie.
The studio lights in Austin always feel a little tighter when a legend sits across the table. But today, the air is heavy. Joe Rogan, a man who's seen every flavor of wild, is leaning back, eyes wide. Mel Gibson isn't just talking about a movie. He's recounting a war zone. We all saw the blood on screen, but we missed the war happening behind the lens. It's time to peel back the veil on what really happened. But before the world saw the cross, Mel had to find the man willing to carry it. The gamble. In the early 2000s, Mel Gibson was the ultimate Hollywood golden boy. He had the Oscar for Braveheart, the Lethal Weapon franchise, and a jawline that seemed carved out of movie star granite. But inside, something was itching. He didn't want another blockbuster. He wanted to tell a story that had been vibrating in his soul for years. He approached the big studios with a pitch that sounded like a career-ending note, a hyper-violent, unflinching depiction of the last 12 hours of Jesus Christ's life, filmed entirely in dead languages like Aramaic and Latin. The suits in the high-rise offices didn't just say no, they laughed. They told him it was unmarketable, too niche, and far too bloody. But Mel wasn't looking for permission. When Hollywood slammed the door, he decided to build his own house. He reached into his own pockets and pulled out $30 million, a staggering sum of personal wealth, to fund the vision himself. This wasn't just a movie anymore. It was a total gamble on his own sanity and reputation. If it failed, he wasn't just losing a paycheck. He was losing his legacy. He moved the production to the rugged, ancient-looking landscapes of Matera, Italy, a place where the stones seemed to hold the weight of centuries. He wasn't interested in the sanitized Sunday school version of the story, where everyone has perfect hair and clean robes. He wanted the dirt. He wanted the sweat. He wanted the visceral, bone-crunching reality of Roman execution. Joe Rogan, listening to this, shakes his head in disbelief because he understands that kind of all-in mentality.
That was a crazy movie because it was a great movie, but it seemed like there was resistance to that movie.
It's the ultimate high-stakes play. Mel was operating without a safety net, ignoring the advice of every PR expert in the business. He hired Jim Caviezel, an actor who shared his intensity, and told him straight up, "This is going to be hard. You might not have a career after this." Mel wasn't trying to make a religious film. He was trying to make a documentary of a sacrifice. He spent months obsessing over every lash of the whip and every drop of prosthetic blood. The industry watched from a distance, waiting for the train wreck. They expected a vanity project that would vanish into obscurity. Instead, they got a man possessed by a vision that refused to be silenced. Mel was a Mad Max in the director's chair, fighting against a system that hated his message and a clock that was ticking down his fortune. He wasn't just making a film, he was preparing for a spiritual war. And the first battle was simply getting the cameras to roll in a world that had already written him off as crazy. But the real madness didn't start until the clouds gathered and the sky, literally, broke open. Lightning on set. If you told a scriptwriter to add "the lead actor gets struck by lightning" to a movie about Jesus, they'd tell you it was too on the nose. It's too cinematic, too Old Testament. But as Mel sat across from Joe, the details he dropped about the production of The Passion sounded less like a film set and more like a biblical trial by fire. Jim Caviezel wasn't just playing a role, he was surviving an ordeal. The physical toll on him was so extreme it borders on the miraculous or the terrifying, depending on how you view the divine. The most famous incident, the one that made Rogan's jaw hit the floor, happened during the filming of the Sermon on the Mount. Out of a clear, overcast sky, a bolt of lightning descended like a finger from the heavens and struck Caviezel directly. Witnesses said his whole body lit up and smoke began to curl out of his ears. It didn't just happen once either. John Michelini, the assistant director, was struck twice during the production. You have to wonder what the odds are. In a world of billion-to-one chances, the man playing the Son of God was literally electrified while standing on a hill. It sent a shockwave through the crew that no amount of Hollywood catering could soothe. But the lightning was just the exclamation point on a sentence of constant suffering. Because Mel insisted on total realism, Caviezel was subjected to grueling conditions that would have broken a lesser man. During the scourging scenes, despite all the precautions and the dummy posts, a whip actually caught him, tearing a 14-inch gash into his back. He didn't just act the pain, he felt the sting of Roman steel. Then came the cold. Filming in the Italian winter, wearing nothing but a thin loincloth, Caviezel developed a case of pneumonia, so severe his lungs were filling with fluid. He was shivering so violently that his limbs would lock up, yet he stayed on that cross for hours. Then there was the shoulder. While carrying the 150-pound wooden cross through the craggy streets of Matera, the heavy timber shifted and dislocated his shoulder. In the film, when you see that look of sheer agonizing exhaustion on his face, that's not method acting. That's a man whose body is physically failing him in real time. He was suffering from skin infections from the makeup, migraines from having one eye stapled shut to simulate the swelling, and a level of fatigue that most people only experience in their worst nightmares. Mel looked at Joe and basically admitted that he pushed Jim to the edge of the abyss. It wasn't about being a tough guy director. It was about capturing a frequency of pain that had never been put on celluloid before. By the time they wrapped, Caviezel had lost 45 pounds and needed open-heart surgery. He didn't just make a movie. He offered up his body as a canvas for Mel's brutal masterpiece. While the physical pain was visible to everyone, there was a darker, subtler shadow lurking in the frames. The shock factor. When Joe Rogan watches a fight, he's looking for the level of reality that most people turn away from. He wants to see the technique, the bone density, and the exact moment a spirit breaks. So, when he sat down to talk about the Passion of Christ, he didn't lead with theology. He led with the violence. He asked the question that millions had asked back in 2004. Mel, why did it have to be that brutal? The film wasn't just R-rated. It was a sensory assault that left audiences weeping in the aisles or walking out in a daze. But as the conversation unfolded, it became clear that the gore wasn't a gimmick. It was the entire point of the exercise. Mel explained that we've become desensitized by centuries of church art. Those pristine porcelain statues of Jesus with a single tiny drop of blood on his side. Mel felt that those images had robbed the story of its weight. He wanted to hit the audience with a sledgehammer. The shock factor was a deliberate attempt to bypass the brain and go straight to the nervous system. Mel told Joe that if he didn't show the absolute destruction of the human form, the resurrection wouldn't mean anything. He wanted people to feel the price. During the scourging at the pillar, the camera lingers on the Roman soldiers as they switch from rods to the flagrum, the whips tipped with metal shards and bone. Rogan, being a student of human anatomy and combat, noted how the sound design alone was enough to make your skin crawl. Every wet thud of the whip and every gasp of air from the actor's lungs was amplified to an uncomfortable degree. It wasn't movie violence, where a guy gets shot and falls down cleanly. This was the slow, methodical dismantling of a human being. Mel's logic was simple. You have to be shocked to be woken up. He argued that the world had become too comfortable with the narrative, treating it like a fairy tale rather than a historical execution. By pushing the violence to an almost unbearable limit, he forced the viewer to confront the physical reality of the sacrifice. This wasn't a safe religious movie for the whole family. It was a horror movie where the monster was human cruelty. Joe pointed out that this approach changed the way people looked at the New Testament forever. You couldn't just read the verses anymore without smelling the copper of the blood and hearing the wood groan under the weight of a body. The controversy that followed, the claims that the movie was pornographic in its violence, only served to prove Mel's point. He told Joe that the pushback came from a place of deep discomfort. People didn't want to see the mess. They wanted the cleaned-up version. But Mel remained unapologetic. He told Joe that he actually held back in some areas because the historical reality of Roman scourging was often even more horrific than what he put on screen. He was aiming for a visceral truth that transcended language barriers. He wanted a guy in a remote village who couldn't read a word of the Bible to look at the screen and understand exactly what was being surrendered. It was a gamble on the power of empathy through agony. And as Joe realized, it was a gamble that changed the landscape of cinema forever. But the blood on the surface was just a distraction from the chilling secrets hidden in the shadows of the lens. What everyone missed. This is where the conversation with Rogan took a turn into the truly eerie. Most people who watched The Passion were so overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the carnage that they missed the psychological chess match happening in the background. Joe, who loves a good hidden-in-plain-sight theory, leaned in as Mel started breaking down the choices that weren't in the script. The biggest one? The depiction of Satan. In most movies, the devil is a guy with horns or a suave businessman in a suit. Mel went the opposite direction. He created an androgynous, pale figure, played by Rosalinda Celentano, who drifts through the crowds like a dream. Mel explained to Joe that the secret to the devil in this film was ambiguity. He wanted the character to be beautiful, but off, something that didn't quite belong to either gender or any specific age. Evil is a master of disguise, Mel told him, but it's always slightly wrong. One of the most haunting details that people missed was the demon baby. In a twisted parody of the Virgin Mary holding the infant Jesus, the Satan figure is seen carrying a bizarre, wrinkled, old-looking child during the scourging. It's a split-second shot that leaves a layer of grease on your soul. Mel told Joe it was meant to represent the perversion of the sacred, the way evil mocks everything that is good. But the symbolism went deeper than just the characters. Mel revealed to Joe that the cinematography was designed to mirror the works of Caravaggio. He used a technique called chiaroscuro, the extreme contrast between deep, suffocating shadows and blinding, harsh light. Every frame was meant to look like a painting come to life, but with a secret language hidden in the darkness. For instance, the way the camera moves during the Garden of Gethsemane scene isn't just for cool shots. It was meant to mimic the POV of a predator. While the disciples are sleeping, the camera, the spirit of temptation, is stalking the perimeter. Rogan was floored by the Aramaic factor, too. While the world focused on the subtitles, Mel pointed out that the sounds of the dead languages were chosen for their vibrational impact. He didn't just want the words. He wanted the guttural, ancient resonance of the throat sounds to bypass the modern ear and trigger something primal in the listener's DNA. There are also subtle cameos that most missed. Mel's own hands are the ones that drive the first nail into the cross. He told Joe he did that because he wanted to acknowledge his own part in the story. A confession hidden in a practical effect. Then there's the raven at the cross. When the bad thief mocks Jesus, a bird suddenly appears and begins to attack him. Most viewers thought it was just a random bit of nature being mean, but Mel explained it was a representation of the immediate spiritual consequences of despair. The film is littered with these breadcrumbs. There are moments where the wind picks up or the light shifts in a way that feels intentional, because it was. Mel wasn't just directing actors. He was choreographing a spiritual atmosphere. He told Joe that even the way the Roman soldiers were lit, from below, making them look like monsters from a campfire story, was a way to dehumanize them, showing how ordinary people can become vessels for something demonic when they lose their empathy. It was a masterclass in subliminal storytelling, but the reaction from the world outside the studio was anything but subtle. The global fallout. When Mel Gibson finally put the finished cut of The Passion into a canister, he didn't just have a movie, he had a radioactive isotope. The industry was terrified of it. As he told Joe, no major studio would touch the distribution. They saw the headlines before the first ticket was even sold. Anti-Semitic, grisly, career-ending. The fallout was global and immediate. Major pundits were calling for boycotts. And some critics didn't just review the film, they performed exorcisms on it in print. One prominent critic famously called it a snuff movie, while others claimed it would incite worldwide violence. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a Roman gladius. But then, the doors opened on Ash Wednesday, 2004. What happened next is a moment in cinematic history that Joe Rogan loves to dissect. The disconnect between the gatekeepers and the people. While the elites were clutching their pearls, the public was lining up around the block. This wasn't just a movie release. It was a cultural pilgrimage. People weren't just eating popcorn. They were sobbing in the aisles. Mel recounted to Joe how the film became a communal experience where strangers were holding hands in the dark. The fallout wasn't a collapse. It was an explosion of interest that defied every rule of the Hollywood playbook. The numbers were staggering. Against that $30 million gamble of Mel's personal cash, the film raked in over $612 million worldwide. It became the highest-grossing R-rated film in domestic history, a record it held for a staggering 20 years until Deadpool and Wolverine finally nudged it aside. It was the ultimate "I told you so" to the studio system. Joe pointed out that Mel essentially hacked the Matrix. He bypassed the middleman and went straight to the heart of a massive, underserved audience. It proved that if you make something with enough raw, uncompromising conviction, the rules of marketing don't apply. However, the victory came with a heavy price tag. Mel shared with Joe how the controversy followed him home. He became a lightning rod for every cultural grievance of the early 2000s. The film didn't just spark conversations, it sparked wars at dinner tables and on cable news. Yet, looking back, Mel wouldn't change a single frame. He told Joe that the fallout was necessary to clear the air. It forced the world to look at a subject it had tried to sanitize for 1,000 years. The film became a permanent landmark in the independent cinema landscape, proving that one man with a vision and a very deep pocket could move the needle of the entire world. As the dust of the first film settled, Mel began looking beyond the grave and into the impossible. The Resurrection sequel. The atmosphere in the studio shifted from historical grit to something far more surreal when Joe asked the question everyone was dying to hear. What's next? Mel didn't just give a standard Hollywood "it's in development" answer. He leaned in and described a project so massive and strange that it made the first film look like a warm-up. He officially confirmed the title, The Resurrection of the Christ, and told Joe that this wasn't just a sequel, it was a journey into the metaphysical. Mel called the script an acid trip, a phrase that immediately piqued Rogan's interest. This isn't a linear story about guys sitting in a tomb waiting for a rock to roll away. Mel is planning to go where no filmmaker has dared. The 3 days between the crucifixion and the resurrection. Between the crucifixion and the resurrection. He told Joe that to tell this story properly, you have to look at the big realms. We're talking about the fall of the angels, the harrowing of hell, and the spiritual slugfest for the souls of humanity. Mel described a narrative that spans from the beginning of time in the firmament down into the depths of Sheol. He wants to show the audience the internal machinery of the universe, the war between ultimate good and ultimate evil that happens in the shadows of the physical world. Joe, visibly blown away, noted that this sounds more like a cosmic epic than a standard biblical drama. Mel agreed, admitting that it took him and writer Randall Wallace nearly a decade to crack the script because the subject matter is almost impossible to understand in human terms. The technical challenge is just as insane as the plot. Jim Caviezel is returning to play Jesus, but since 20 years have passed in our world while only 3 days have passed in the movie's timeline, Mel is planning to use state-of-the-art de-aging technology. He told Joe the tech has finally reached a point where it doesn't look uncanny or fake. He wants the transition to be seamless, so the audience feels like they've stepped right back into the blood-stained streets of Jerusalem. But the real acid trip will be the depiction of hell. Mel spoke about avoiding the cheesy or obvious tropes of fire and pitchforks, aiming instead for something that evokes raw, primal emotion through lighting and sound. As of early 2026, the project has grown into such a massive vision that it's being prepared as a 2-part event. Mel shared that he wants to release the first part on Good Friday and the second on Ascension Day, creating a global cinematic experience that mirrors the liturgical calendar. He told Joe that he feels the immense pressure to get it right, because the resurrection is the ultimate story. If the first movie was about the price of redemption, this one is about the power that was unleashed because of it. It's a gamble on the unseen, and Mel is walking back up to the plate with the same all-in energy that defined his career decades ago. Beyond the de-aging tech and the cosmic battles, the true mystery remains. Why does this story still have such a grip on our collective psyche? The legacy. When Joe Rogan asked Mel Gibson about the aftermath, the conversation drifted into a space that was less about box office numbers and more about the strange, permanent mark the film left on everyone who touched it. The legacy of The Passion of the Christ isn't just that it made a lot of money, it's that it functioned as a career-altering and, in some cases, life-threatening event. Take Jim Caviezel. As Mel recounted to Joe, the actor didn't just walk away with a few scars and a great resume. He walked away a changed man. Mel had warned him early on, "If you do this, you might never work in this town again." And for a long time, that prediction held true. Caviezel found himself on the outside of the Hollywood Cool Kids Club, effectively blackballed by an industry that found his participation in such a visceral, religious project too controversial to handle. But, as he later told interviewers, he didn't regret it for a second. He saw the suffering on set, the lightning strikes, the heart surgery he eventually needed, the pneumonia, as a refining fire. He didn't just play a role, he carried a cross that broke his body, but, in his view, saved his soul. Joe pointed out that this kind of commitment is almost extinct in modern cinema. We live in an era of green screens and safety first, where actors are rarely asked to endure anything more than a long day in a trailer. The legacy of The Passion is its status as a primitive technological feat. It's a movie made with blood and dirt in an age of pixels. Mel explained that the film's staying power comes from that authenticity. Even 20 years later, in a hyper-secular 2026, the movie remains the gold standard for religious storytelling because it refuses to be polite. It doesn't ask for your permission to be graphic. It demands that you look. The film also created what industry insiders call the passion effect. Before 2004, faith-based movies were relegated to the dusty corners of Christian bookstores. Mel proved there was a massive, hungry audience that the major studios were completely ignoring. He opened the floodgates for films like Sound of Freedom and The Chosen, showing that independent, belief-driven art could compete with and beat the biggest blockbusters in the world. But more than that, the legacy is found in the way it haunts the viewer. Mel told Joe about people who saw the film and immediately went to confess crimes they'd hidden for years. It wasn't just entertainment, it was a mirror. It forced people to reckon with the concept of sacrifice in a way that modern life rarely requires. For Mel, the legacy isn't the 600 million. It's the fact that decades later, people are still shocked by the truth of it. The episode ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, mutual respect. Joe Rogan, the ultimate skeptic, and Mel Gibson, the ultimate believer, found a weird kind of common ground in the idea of the uncancelable man. For years, the world tried to write Mel Gibson off. They called him a relic, a pariah, a man whose time had passed. But as he sat there in 2026, talking about his acid trip resurrection sequel and his collaboration with historians, it was clear that the fire hadn't gone out. If anything, it had turned into a steady, unstoppable glow. Mel's takeaway for Joe was simple. The truth doesn't need a PR firm. Whether you're talking about the historical accuracy of the Gospels or the physical reality of a Roman whip, the facts remain long after the controversy fades. He told Joe that nobody dies for a lie, referring to the apostles who were martyred for their claims. It was a line that seemed to resonate with Rogan. The idea that conviction, when it's real, is the most powerful force in the universe. The Passion of the Christ remains a cinematic anomaly, a beautiful, brutal, and bizarre masterpiece that everyone missed because they were too busy looking at the surface. But through the lens of a long-form conversation in a Texas studio, the layers were finally peeled back. We saw the miracles on set, the hidden demons in the shadows, and the man who was crazy enough to bet $30 million on a story the world thought it already knew. Gibson's next act. As the conversation in the Austin studio wound down, Joe Rogan asked the question that's been lingering in Hollywood for decades. What's next for a guy who has already broken the mold? Mel didn't hesitate. While the world is still reeling from the legacy of his first biblical epic, Gibson is currently steering a massive, multi-lane production slate that feels like a full-throttle comeback. He's not just leaning into the spiritual, he's returning to the high-octane action and gritty storytelling that made him a household name in the first place, proving that at nearly 70, he still has more energy than directors half his age. The biggest elephant in the room remains the resurrection of the Christ. As of early 2026, Mel has officially moved from talking to doing. After years of script revisions, blending what he calls the structured version with the acid trip metaphysical draft, principal photography is slated for later this year. He's returning to the ancient, sun-bleached stones of Matera, Italy, to capture the harrowing of hell and the celestial fallout of the 3 days after the crucifixion. But that's just one piece of the puzzle. Gibson is also currently deep in the trenches of the action thriller world. His latest directorial effort, Flight Risk, starring Mark Wahlberg as a bald, sociopathic pilot, just hit theaters and served as a reminder of Mel's ability to squeeze tension out of a confined space. It was a test run for his new lean and mean production style, using minimal sets and cutting-edge digital tech to tell a story that feels massive despite a modest budget. But perhaps the most surprising news he dropped for Joe was the status of Lethal Weapon 5. After the passing of his longtime friend and mentor Richard Donner, Mel has officially stepped up to direct the final chapter of the Riggs and Murtaugh saga. He told Joe that he's carrying the torch for Donner, using a script that is funny but deeply emotional. He's managing a delicate balancing act, preparing to descend into the depths of hell for a spiritual sequel while simultaneously getting ready to jump back into a police cruiser with Danny Glover for one last ride. It's a career trajectory that defies logic, part theologian, part action hero, and entirely uncompromising. Mel Gibson's next act isn't about seeking redemption from the industry. It's about absolute creative freedom. Whether he's de-aging Jim Caviezel for a cosmic battle against demons, or directing a buddy cop finale that's decades in the making, he is operating on his own frequency. He told Joe that he's finally out of the woods, and looking at his upcoming schedule, it's clear that the man who once bet his entire fortune on a dead language movie is still the biggest gambler in the room. The world is waiting to see if he can strike lightning a second time. And if his recent momentum is any indication, the sky is about to break open once again. Hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into the stories Hollywood is too afraid to tell.